Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lunch dev session. Today we got a really cool one with Anthony Campolo. Am I saying that right? I always worry that I'm not saying it.
Yeah, Campolo.
Sweet. Anthony Campolo, AJC web dev on the Twitters and the GitHubs and the dev.to and all the places. Is there any place that you're
Those are
not?
the only three that matter.
The
So that's
only
good.
three that matter. You're not pushing hard into Instagram or anything like that.
I mean, I am starting to Twitch, so that
Okay.
is that is one other one that you might want to add to the list, I guess.
Okay, twitch.tv/slash AJC web dev. Yeah, and so today he's just going to show us how to query a GraphQL API. I'm super excited about this because it's at my speed. And yeah, without any further ado, Anthony, take it away. Show us what you got.
All right. Thanks so much, Michael. Always happy to do these presentations. And I'm really excited to talk about GraphQL today. And I know there's a couple people in the server who are really interested in it and some who have a decent amount of experience in it. And this is really going to be like a GraphQL 101 kind of talk, especially from a front-end dev's perspective, because I think that's a similar area that a lot of us are coming from. So we're not really going to talk at all about like what it means to like make a GraphQL API. We're going to take as a given we have this GraphQL API already. And just before I get into it, I also want to like encourage anyone to just stop me, ask questions at any point. I like these being interactive, and I think it's good to kind of like make sure that what I'm saying actually makes sense and whatnot. So anyone could just go to this URL right here, and this is what you'll see. These are commonly referred to as what's called a graphical playground, like GraphQL, but with an I right before the Q and the L. And these are really nice for a couple reasons. One, they give you this docs thing right here. So what we're going to try and do with this API is we just want to make a query for a list of character names. That's all we want to do. And so we see here, we have this characters query. And when we open that, it gives us all this information. And so in the type details, we have type characters. And to actually get an array of each character, we define this results object. And so that's going to be on character. So if we go to character, then we see the type character and what we were looking for, which is their name. So that's one way you can kind of do it. You can just go through the docs and like drill your way down to what you're looking for, or you can do it by just like getting error messages from it. So you want to first say that you're going to get a query, and this query is going to be for characters. And if we do that, it's going to say field characters of type characters must have a selection of subfields. Did you mean characters? Blah, blah, blah. So what's saying here is that what you're asking for almost makes sense. We know that you want something on the characters, but you got to tell us what you actually want. Because as you saw in the docs, there's a bunch of stuff here. So they need to know exactly what we want. But there's actually kind of a gotcha here, because what you really need is you need this results thing here. So if you then go to results, then we're going to get another error saying field results of type character must have a selection of subfields. So same thing again. Did you mean results? Blah, blah, blah. So now what we want this time is going to be the name. And you also see how we're getting this autocomplete right here. So if you hit Control Space, you can just say, oh, this is the stuff I can get. So you do that, and now we're getting our character names. Rick Sanchez of Rick and Morty fame, and Morty of Rick and Morty fame. And let's say we also wanted to know who's alive or dead. Then we just add the status, and we can get who is alive or dead. So that's pretty nice. And this is just all on the API endpoint that anyone can go to and anyone can start querying. You can also make requests with some sort of API request tool, say like Insomnia. You could do this as well with Postman. And I find that Insomnia has really good GraphQL integration. So that's why I like using it personally. So if we first say, we just made a blank post request to this API, it's going to error out, and it's going to say post body missing. did you forget to use body parser middleware? Now this is saying that you know that they want to send a GraphQL string. And that's essentially why you have this GraphQL query selection right here. And then if you do that, it gives you a different error now, saying must provide query string. So it knows that you're trying to send GraphQL request. And now it's saying we actually need you to give us query string, which we can just grab this exact same query string we used before and just copy paste it over. And when we do that, we get the exact same thing in our Insomnia. Okay, that's cool. But what if we actually wanted to like interact with the data? Once we get it back, we want to then use it in, say, a website. That's why you would need something like JavaScript and HTML. That's where all this front end stuff is going to enter the picture. Now I've got this blog post that I've written that I kind of went a little nuts on. And if you kind of follow this, you end up at this project, which is basically like a kind of a mono repo setup where I basically hit the Rick and Morty API with just the fetch API with a library called Graphql Request and then with Apollo Client. I'm going to do a fairly similar thing for this talk, but instead of building out 3 separate projects with their own folder structure and package.json and all that, I'm just going to have one project. I'm going to transition it from one to the other. So you can kind of see what it means to hit it just with the fetch API and then what you would get adding in something like GraphQL Request and what you get adding in Apollo Client. So that's kind of the idea of what we're going to do. So let's get some stuff open. We're going to just first create a project, Rick and Morty, and then we're going to go into that project. And we're going to create 2 folders, public and source. And then we're going to create an index.html and a src/index.js. And that's going to be the whole project. And then we'll eventually add a package.json for once we get some libraries, but you don't actually need a package.json at all to just make a GraphQL request. You can just do it with just these 2 files here, which is pretty cool. So if we go back to the repo, this is going to be a pretty simple, basic HTML boilerplate. So we've got our meta tags, and then we've got a title. And right here, this is where we're importing the JavaScript script. So we're using the script tag, and then we just have a little body, similar to what you would see in like a Create React app. So once we got that going, we can open a live server and see that. So right now we're just seeing that H1 right there. So now all we have to do to make a fetch request, let me just pull that guy out. So to make the fetch request, you've got a couple things going on. Sorry. Cool. All right. We've got the fetch request here, and you have the actual endpoint that you're hitting, and then like the options. So this should look fairly familiar to anyone who's ever used the fetch API anymore. This is like a very, very stripped down call, and all we're doing is making a post. And this is kind of important. In GraphQL, there are only posts. You don't make gets or puts or anything like that because you're always just sending a string, and then the backend knows what to do with that based on the information contained in the string. Because we're saying here we want a query. If we want a mutation, we would specify a mutation. So in terms of being like create, read, update, delete stuff, that's kind of baked into GraphQL itself, which is why your methods are only post, which can kind of throw some people off. And then we just have a single header, which sets the content type to JSON. And then this is the string that we're throwing over the wire. And we're going to console log it. So if we take a look at that, we now see we have this object here, and this object has characters, results, and that's our character list. So that's all you got to do to make the request with the Fetch API. Cool. Everyone still with me?
I
Yeah, I was
love.
going to say these. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. Michael G, you go first.
Okay, I was going to say initially with my first experience with GraphQL is doing this just in a JavaScript file and just pasting in literally just a string, a template string, and fetching it that way. So this is definitely very familiar to my introduction to GraphQL.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
You say something, Michael?
yeah, I really like what you've demonstrated here as well. Just the most basic possible like JavaScript APIs only request to a GraphQL server, because I think a lot of people feel like maybe it's magic when they're first coming to it, or like you have to use a GraphQL client to like query a GraphQL API. And it's so cool to see, like, at the end of the day, it's just a fetch request like anything else, but with the, a little bit more uh a little bit more that you have to add in there, but it's great.
Yeah, the biggest thing you really need to know is just how to make the query at all, which kind of is like learning the syntax of GraphQL, but the syntax is pretty minimal. And the idea is that they wanted to approximate as much as possible just sending JSON of like the exact object you wanted to get back, but just like the key and not the value. And so that's kind of the idea, is you're sending this and then you're getting this back. And if we did this, we just got the data object. We now see we're getting this data object here instead of the characters. And if we did .data, goes back to characters, and then we can get characters. So now we're getting the results, and then we can say dot results as well. So you can just kind of go down the hierarchy of what you're getting back very easily, which is really nice. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is now we're going to bring in the GraphQL Request. And GraphQL Request is a library from the Prisma folks. And it's a really nice, lightweight GraphQL client. So this is why I have this as like the middle thing in between the Fetch API and the Apollo client, because it's just kind of taking what you would do with Fetch and giving you a couple nice little abstractions for the stuff that you're going to do with every single GraphQL request, mainly like parsing the string. That's really what I think you get from this, and then also like makes it a little easier to like set headers and stuff like that. But it's not as in depth as something like Apollo client, which we'll get more into once we get to Apollo. So this is all you got to do in terms of making that request. And this should look fairly similar to what we saw before. We have a query string, we have some sort of request that's hitting an API, and then just pulling the data out with a promise. So what we're going to do now is we're going to just set up a basic little front end that's going to allow us to just set up a little GraphQL requests project. So we got that, and we got that. And the dependencies we're installing here is we're just going to have React, React DOM, and React scripts, and then GraphQL Request. And then it's important to also get this GraphQL library as well, because it's a dependency of GraphQL Request. And it's like the kind of like the base library that was the first thing that kind of came out of this whole GraphQL thing. And then there's another one, GraphQL-JS. That's like the main JavaScript library, because GraphQL is agnostic to language. And that's one of the things that's really cool about it. And you just have different packages, essentially for different languages, GraphQL-Ruby, GraphQL-Python, on and on and on. And now we got those installed. We're going to go ahead and just grab this. And this is just basically setting the browser list mostly, and the scripts just kind of like a simple boil down, create React app. Okay. And then the HTML is going to stay essentially the same. We still have all the same stuff from before. And then in index, actually a big decent amount of stuff happening here. So now what we're going to do is we're bringing in the GraphQL Client. And this is basically going to allow us to like instantiate a GraphQL Client object and then pass that object the things that it needs. Those things being the endpoint, which is here. And then we have this get characters query here. So this is what I was talking about in terms of doing the parsing of the string. This GQL thing is what's basically taking your query string here. And you notice now we have like syntax highlighting on it. And pretty common convention to have all uppercase with what's the word for these things. And then you have your underscore. Then you have your const data is equaling to GraphQL. And then you just do dot request and pass in the request. And then all we're going to do is just pop it out into the console. And it's inside a function, so we have to actually run that function. And then I gotta save this guy. I know why, because I didn't actually start a development server with this one. So before we just were running on port 5500 with the built-in live server, but now we're actually using React. So we got to kick up our React scripts. So now we see GraphQl request there. And this is now what we're getting out. So pretty much exactly the same as what we were doing before, except now you see we're actually just getting like a string kind of object. And that's pretty nice because then you can just start mapping over it if you can basically like know what the schema is. And again, you can go back and look at the schema anytime you want over here. So that is that. Now, Apollo is where things start to get a lot more complicated. And the reasoning for this is that there's a lot more to manage around these like requests and just everything that goes along with creating a full application. Because what we're doing now is we're just sending, basic requests and getting some data back. But there's, considerations of, okay, what about like caching and retries and, debouncing and all this kind of stuff that goes on top, or offline capabilities. Like how do you have something that can constantly sync with your app and then can know when it's offline or online, know when to send data back to the server. So there's all this stuff that goes along with it, which is why you would have something like Apollo Client, or you can kind of approximate something like Apollo Client if you were to take GraphQL Request and add another thing to it that can do some of the functionality that Apollo Client can do. And this is actually something that I've seen in Redwood, and it's been really interesting to watch because there was a conversation that went on for many months about making the Redwood provider swappable. And what that means is you have what's called the Apollo provider, which is right here. So the Apollo provider, it's just a thing that like wraps your group component. It's just kind of like what you do with a Redux or something like that. And the Redwood provider, it does the same thing. It says Redwood instead of Apollo, and it was basically just Apollo under the hood because that's what Redwood is. It's a bunch of libraries combined together and with nice abstractions to make them work. But there were a lot of people who wanted to use other clients. And as you're seeing here, there's a lot of different ways to do it. There's a lot of different options with a wide range of like trade-offs. And so they basically decoupled the Apollo provider from like the Redwood provider thing itself. So it's just now called the Redwood provider. It's called the Redwood Apollo provider, I think is what it's called. And then you could swap that out. And the other kind of implementation now is a combination of GraphQL Request and React Query. And so React Query gives you a lot of the kind of caching benefits that you would want. And it's much newer and has a lot of momentum behind it in the community. But Apollo is, been around forever. It's kind of like tried and true, and it's fairly stable, especially the client. And I find that it's a good way to start, definitely, because it's going to give you like all the things you'd really need for like a serious app. And there's a lot of docs, and it's been around for a while. But I think there's most likely going to be a shift over the next like year or two towards a much wider range of clients and client kind of solutions. But it's kind of hard to say with these things, you know. All right, so these are the only two dependencies that we're going to add here. Apollo Boost is kind of like a pared down version of what used to be the Apollo Client. The Apollo Client was massive, and even now it's still pretty big, but this is a fairly good way to get going if you just want like the most stripped down basic Apollo. And then we have these React hooks, which is going to allow us to do like our use query hook, which is very familiar to anyone who's used something like a React query. So now that that's all going. Okay. So we're going to add those dependencies. And then this is basically the same thing as before. And then I think this was, yeah, that's exactly the same. We can also start to think more now about how we would actually like break this up into different pieces, because if we were to put all this in just one giant file like we've been doing up to this point, it's going to start to get like super unwieldy. So there's a lot of people with a lot of thoughts about how to do this, and this is a lot of what Redwood had to do with, is coming up with a file structure, and a file structure that was based around kind of how these different pieces can be decoupled. And there's not really a consensus, I would say, at this point in terms of how to do it. Fine, it's a lot like React in that sense, that it's like pretty flexible because it's React, like we're in React right now. So you can break up pieces apart into different components however you like. This is the way that I find makes the most sense for GraphQL specifically. To me, I think there's actually a very natural way to do this, and that's kind of what I'm going to go through here. So first thing we're going to do is just create the client like we did before, and all the client has is just an endpoint. So we're going to take that, and we're going to create some files as well. So inside our source folder, we're going to create a client.js. And that's Apollo Client. And Apollo Client, that's coming from the Apollo Boost library that we downloaded. And then this is going to be the get characters query. And this is using that GQL again, GraphQL tag, which is what is doing the parsing of the string. So this is one thing that I do very differently from Redwood, because in Redwood you have a cell which has your query and all of the different states it can be in, like all in one giant file. And this is a thing that I like to do because I think it makes sense to have the query be its like own thing, because as we've seen, the query is what has stayed consistent across this entire process. Like everything around the query has changed in terms of how you make the request, what headers you need to pass, how you parse the string, how you get the data back, how you display it. All that stuff changes. The only thing that actually stays constant throughout the whole process is string. So that's kind of why it makes sense in my brain for it to be in its own kind of file, because then anytime you want, you just go grab it and then paste it into wherever it is that you need it. And then, so this will be the characters component. And this one you could probably break up into a couple more pieces, but for an example like this, I think this works out pretty well. So now we're going to create characters.js. And this will be our character component. And to do this, we're going to be importing a couple things from other places in our project. So we just created that get characters file, and we're pulling in the get characters query. And then this is our use query hook. And there's going to be three things you can get out of the query, which is data, loading, and error. This is very similar to the Redwood cell, and this is again, Redwood uses Apollo, so Red was kind of just creating an abstraction on top of this. And it's so you don't have to do what we're doing here, which is like write this kind of conditional logic to say, if it's loading, return this, if error, return this. Now for a component this size, it's not really a big deal. The where cells become really useful is when you have just like lots and lots and lots of components that are doing lots and lots of fetching, and there's tons and tons of room for error in terms of how they're set up, and just having like those kind of fallbacks in place so that as you're developing, like every time you get an error, it just appears on the screen, and every time, it works out, like you just see the data on the screen because of the defaults that are built in. And then here, we're just going to take that characters. I guess this is actually, here's a question for you guys. Who knows what this thing is? And a question mark period.
Where my Ruby people at? Optional chain?
Does anyone know what it actually does?
Yeah, I've used, so my experience in this is, I don't know if I've even used this in JavaScript yet, but I used it in CoffeeScript all the time. Did you what was it? What'd you call it? No, optional chaining? Is that right?
Yeah, it's optional chaining, yeah.
Okay.
Or the Elvis operator, so some people call it.
Oh yeah, because it's so funny. It took me, I literally had to Google like, why do people call this the Elvis operator? Because I couldn't see it, and then once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah, I know, right? Okay, so optional chaining, it permits reading the value of a property located deep within a chain of connected objects without having to expressly validate that each reference in the chain is valid. So it's basically saying, hey, I want a thing that's somewhere in this big group of thing. I don't care if there's a bunch of other stuff messed up in it, just give me the thing I want back. So it's one of those things where I can imagine why JavaScript developers who've had to deal with the oddities of JavaScript forever are just like, just give me the just do it for me operator. That's kind of how I think about it. So that's basically taking the character's data and setting it data. And that's okay. So now we actually have all this stuff now in our index.js, and we'll see our index.js is super small and concise. Very nice. Okay, so now what we got going on here is all we really have is the Apollo provider, and that client, the client being this thing that we create over here, and then the characters that we're pulling in here. And so we're going to return the characters there, and then we're going to pass client into client here for the Apollo provider. And so this is pretty dang similar to what you get from like the Redwood front end, minus things like cells and the generator commands. But in terms of like what Apollo client does for you, it's just like they have already set up for you out of the box, ready to send queries. And that's why it's really nice. It was really great for me as someone who didn't really know a lot about GraphQL, because I got to go through Redwood and be kind of like slowly exposed to it. Because like if you think about essentially anytime you're writing Redwood, like you're writing GraphQL, because the way your front end and your back end are talking to each other is through GraphQL. So like you can't do anything without writing a GraphQL query or a mutation or anything. And I didn't realize like how much more there was to it though until I started doing things without it. And that's why I've kind of gone through this whole process of having learned Redwood. I then kind of went back and built all up this stuff up myself to kind of try and get a handle on. There's still like a billion other things I was doing that I haven't done that point I'm going to. Like I'm not going to build a whole testing suite, But in terms of like just understanding the architecture, it's really useful to kind of decouple the pieces and pull them back all together. And let's see what I'll save. All right, let's see what happens. So now we're gonna npm start this, and this will be over here. And there we go. Cool. So now we're actually displaying the data on the page. And something that I haven't shown yet actually is you get really nice network output for these GraphQL requests. So we see here we have GraphQL status 200 fetch. And then if we open that up, we can see the headers, which is going to the Rick and Morty API, making a post. And you got all of that standard stuff. And then all the way here at the bottom, you can actually see they're telling you what query you sent. So that's what the operation name is. They're saying, I'm sending a query called get characters. Because in our query, we had, so in our query, we had get characters. So that's what that is. So that's what's kind of cool, is that like the actual thing that GraphQL is doing is always going to tell you explicitly whether you're doing a query or a mutation, just by way of it being baked into the syntax. And then you always get this nice little preview object here of all the stuff. And cool.
That's pretty sweet. So now
questions?
the type name, is that returned in the API? I don't remember seeing it in the kind of our original request, but I'm seeing it now. Or is that kind of an augmentation of the Apollo client?
Yeah, that's a great question. So so it's being added for you, like you said, because we're not sending it ourselves. And so if we were to add it in, I don't think it would do anything different.
And excuse me if you covered it already. I dropped a little bit. My internet was a little bit wonky, but you just touched on that it was going to tell you the difference between a query and a mutation. I don't know if anyone that doesn't know what the difference between those is, but could you go over that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so the difference between a query and a mutation, if you've ever heard of command query responsibility segregation, CQRS, I think that's what all those letters stand for. It's actually, I think, pretty much the same way to think about it. They may not be like exactly the same implementation, but a query basically means you're getting data. So you're asking for data. It's a read. You're only pulling data out. You're not changing any data. And so that's different from a mutation, which in CQRS would be a command. And that's something that does a thing. So I think of it as you have the read of CRUD, then you have the create, update, delete. So the reading being the queries, and then the creating, updating, and deleting being the mutations. This is actually something that we can look at in a Redwood project, actually. So in our Redwood schema, we give you, with the generators, an entire schema with the CRUD capabilities already in it. And so what's cool about that is it was kind of the first time I'd ever even seen like a schema at all, but it was very readable, and it was kind of placed in the context of a tutorial that I was doing that was already really nice and made a lot of sense. And it's about a blog. So most people can look at this, and if they stare at it long enough, they'll figure it out. You have a post, because it's a blog, and that post has an ID, title, body, and created at. And then what we were doing before with the queries, these are the queries we can make. So query for posts gives you all the posts back, just like characters, give you the characters back. And then here's where you get into the mutation stuff. And so this is why I didn't really go into this too much, because there's a lot that goes along with it in terms of these input types, especially. So with input types, it's just separating your input from everything else. And this is my theory. My theory is this is just because this was made to work very well with React. Like they kind of go together in a lot of ways. And with React, like your input is something that's like really, really important, because that's where you have like your change handlers and everything. That's where you're like watching state, and you have so much like going on. It's also where you don't want to lose anything. Like it's where stuff can go wrong. And so by separating out the input, it lets you always like be very careful about what it is and where it is and what it's doing. And then these are the actual mutations. So create post, update post, and delete post, just basic CRUD terminology. And then they take in these arguments. So they basically take in the input. So you'll send in a create post input, and that has the title and the body. And then it gives that as the input, and then it outputs the post. So that's kind of what the syntax is saying, that this takes in this information and then returns this. And so update post, you have to also give it the ID, just tell which post you want to update. And then you also give it the new post of whatever it is that you're changing, and you'll get the post back. And then same with delete post, you have to just give it the ID of the post you want to delete. So it's kind of like the basic difference between a query and a mutation. So hopefully that makes sense.
Great answer. Thank you, Anthony.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I remember when that first kind of clicked in my brain. I was just like, oh, wow, that's like super duper nice. So this is that query we were looking at before with the type name as well. So the type name, this is a good thing to point out because GraphQL is also very like type heavy, like you're kind of like declaring types, So it has a lot of people in the community who are like super duper into TypeScript, and that's why there's a decent amount of like TypeScript tooling being built for it. Oops. Accidentally hit my Siri button. And what's cool about that is you can actually get a lot of the benefits you would get from something like TypeScript in it without needing necessarily to have TypeScript, because you have like all of your API, underlying API or types. So when you're writing in JavaScript, you can still get a lot of the same autocomplete and like seeing what, like doing the command or control space, like see what you have. You can do a lot of that without actually having to have TypeScript, which I find really, really interesting. So yeah, so that is the exact same thing, except now with the type names. So I would imagine those are being added by Paul. That's funny that this is now reminding me of a long, obscure Redwood thread that has to do with type name and Apollo and weirdness around it. Let's check out another same project.
Hello.
So I know a couple people here have seen a little bit of Redwood at this point because I know stuff about it. But the main project structure you got going on here is API, and then you have your web folder. And what's really cool about this is if you think about what we were just doing there, we were making the requests to the API. So what this is doing is allows you to have your API actually in your project as well. And this is where you can kind of straddle that line between the front end and the back end when you're working with a framework like Redwood, and you are writing GraphQL requests that are going straight into your back end. So inside our web folder, this is a similar structure to what we're already looking at. We got public folder, we got a source folder, we got package.json, and we see here we got Redwood Forms, Redwood Router, and Redwood Web. So if we check these out, these are on npm, and this is you can just kind of see what actually makes up some of these things. So if you take a look at what we got here, you'll see some of the exact same libraries and dependencies that we already were using. We have GraphQL there, and notice how I said we'd used Apollo Boost and the Apollo React hooks. This brings in the entire client because we want other stuff that I wasn't necessarily using. And then things like React Hot Toast, which I think is a fairly new addition. And then if we go look at the API side, then we'll see that it's also using Apollo Server, specifically Apollo Server Lambda. Now, this is very interesting. So Apollo Server Lambda, what's happening, this is the way that the GraphQL server eventually becomes one giant AWS Lambda handler. Now, there's a really cool term for this that Chris Munns is the one who at least tipped me off to. I don't know if you actually came up with it or not, called a Lambda Lift. So a Lambda Lift is when you take the entire monolith, a monolithic backend, like say something modeled on Ruby on Rails, and shove that into one giant Lambda handler. And you can actually see that in a Redwood project. If you go look in the API and src and functions, you have this graphql.js file. And this is where the real magic is happening. So when people say frameworks have a lot of magic, kind of what they mean by that is that there's a bunch of stuff, and I don't know what that code does, and I'm scared to touch it. But this is something that at least is understandable in a high level if you just kind of look at it, because it's well named. What we're doing here is we're creating a GraphQL handler. How do I know that? This variable says create GraphQL handler. And then we are putting it into this handler here. And what we're doing is we are stitching it all together because we have a bunch of stuff in our backend. We have the actual schema, which I was showing you before, and then we have the DB, which is the Prisma client. And this is how you do your like ORM database type stuff, which is actually doesn't really have anything to do with GraphQL at this point because Prisma is now decoupled from GraphQL. And that is one of the ultimate rabbit holes if you want to go down the history of Prisma. My God. Okay, so, and then you have your services. And this is where the actual like server logic is actually happening. So if people know like controllers, that's kind of how a lot of people think about these. I've been told, because I've never done Rails, I've been told that the difference is that services can call each other, whereas you wouldn't have controllers call each other. So they're slightly different in some senses, but they're fairly similar conceptually in how they sit within your project. And you have your dot find many, and then dot, that's like find one, then all your crud. Now, these services though is where the GraphQL comes in, because this is our schema, right? We had posts inside our post schema. So we have posts, and we can make a request straight into this backend. And the way we do that is on the website. So the website has got components, layouts, pages. The whole folder structure is not important for what we're talking about right now. And the cell is how we do the query. So this should look fairly familiar based on what we've already been doing. So we have this query string right here, and our query is for blog posts query. And then the query is for the posts, and we want the ID, title, body, and create. So this is giving us everything. And then this is what I was talking about in terms of the data fetching being declarative, and it handles the loading, empty, failure, success. And there's another actually interesting thing going on. Let's see how that works. Yeah, we got an issue going on that I thought was super interesting. And I know there's some people here who actually know some stuff about TypeScript. And so we have to type the cells. So this is the one, static typing for cells. And there's a really interesting discussion that I would really love to get some people's opinions on this, because I feel like there has to be someone here who has an opinion on this. Okay, is a cell a higher order component or not? We've been saying it's a higher order component for as long as I've been around. This guy's like, nah, it's not. Here's why. And so he gives kind of like a breakdown of why he thought that. So it's in here, I think. Yes, sorry. It's going to be down a little bit. There we go. Okay, so cells aren't even higher order components in the conventional sense. A typical higher order component wraps a single child component and enhances it with specific functionality, like by passing in new props. So with subscription as a higher order component makes sense. And if you call with subscription with my component inside, you're saying I want a copy of my component with the subscription passed in. But it doesn't make as much sense with a cell. If you call the with cell with the query and the success, you're not saying that I want a copy of the query and success. It's constructing a new component from a number of inputs. To me, this is kind of the cleanest, nicest abstraction for making GraphQL queries. Now, the problem, though, is that this is based totally around making those queries directly into your whole Prisma setup. So you got all this kind of stuff coupled together, but there is some cool cookbooks, and we're gonna start expanding this out a lot, where you can just make queries either from the website or from the cert or from the API side. Now, whether you want to do one or the other has to do with keys and how you need to manage your keys. So the first example they give is for this weather app data. And we're going to have a form. And we're going to... Oh, wait. I'm not sure where the query is in that one. But the backend one is kind of, and what I wanted to, oh, here we go. There it is. So they're just using fetch and with an on submit, sticking in that whole thing there. And then, so this is fairly similar to what we were doing before, in terms of just using the fetch API. But the problem is you can't trust the client. This is a really important thing, is like, don't trust the client. Basically what that means is anytime you send code to the browser to someone else's device and it's like in the client, like that's all code that someone can see. Most people aren't going to see it because most people don't even know that you can see code in the browser. But if you're someone who knows how to go into the dev tool, source maps, and go look through the Webpack output, you can see like the environment variables, like they're just right there. And so that's bad, especially if your keys are connected to, say, a database or, you know, any of the things that you don't want your keys attached to. So there's like some really serious security implications for a lot of this, and it's not like super well talked about or discussed, I feel like, and it's something that I kind of like slowly wrap my mind around from hearing a lot of people around me talking about it. But what's so crazy is that like Redwood already solved this problem. Like they solved it a really long time ago. Because they have the API side, and the API side can be deployed to a serverless Lambda. So that's the whole deal here, is that the serverless Lambda is what lets you make that request in a way that's not going to expose it to the client. So we're using node fetch here, and it's inside our services. We're now in the API folder, which is that whole backend I was showing you, and you were able to just write a really simple query inside your service, like we're doing here, and then just return the data. And then he's kind of showing a little example there at the graphical. And then you can pull in a cell and then have your front end query your back end to then get what it needs, but without needing the key. And then you have your query there, your cell, and that's all that. And then you can get the thing. So that is why you would want to use a framework that has these kind of like conventions baked in already, because not only does it have the API set up already, but it also has a really nice deployment story baked in as well. So you could deploy this to something like a Netlify or a Vercel, and you're already set up really easily. And then what was kind of funny for me going through this whole process is that I kind of like built this with another member of the Redwood team a long time ago, and then didn't really realize what was happening for a while. And then kind of realized that basically what DT had given me was like the reason why he set up the way he did is because of like all that stuff I just said. So if we check out this project, what's happening here is I used FauntDB and basically did exactly what we were doing there. And we have here, we're using GraphQl Request again, but this time we're using it in the API side. And we're setting the endpoint and we're giving it Fauna key. So this is the key that you don't want to expose. And this is the thing that makes building any of these things super complicated. Because anytime you go through a tutorial, you can't just give them code that works, because they have to go and figure out where their key is and how to get it and how to manage it, and you can get a .env file or all that stuff. And then you actually make the request here again in a service. And so this was back in like August. And then when I started working for StepZen, like I was building out these kind of like example projects, and then at a certain point, it all kind of clicked into my brain. And I was like, oh, okay, it's just like the key. It's all about the key. So yeah, cool. Anyone have any more questions?
Thanks, Anthony, so much. I really appreciate it. Appreciate you being here, helping us kind of understand querying GraphQL APIs better. I really love the path that you took into just doing it with like JavaScript and HTML. If you're watching this later on YouTube, please subscribe if you want more videos like this. And we'll have all of the links in the description as well. And yeah, please join us in Discord, events.lunch.dev/Discord. That's where we hang out all the time. A bunch of lovely, beautiful people hanging out, learning together. And that's it. And we'll See you next time.